on, y'all? Hope y'all doing marvelous as always. Welcome back. And real quick, y'all see what's next to me, right? If y'all follow my Instagram, I shared a story where I talked about the whiteboard being effectively gone. I let my mom's have it, and I'm actually at her house right now in her sunroom, which is where I'm going to record the concluding video to my military training series. So this is part 4, which is where I'm going to go over my final thoughts. Since, of course, I don't have a whiteboard and I'm not at my place, got a piece of paper with me. If you made it here to my part 4, right, I can only assume you have seen parts 1 through 3. If you have not, then please make sure you go check those out first. I'm still thinking about this one, but for a little while I pondered the idea of creating a separate series, not a session or anything like that, not whiteboard, not meals or anything, just kind of like a series where I talk about the Army experience for me. So I'm still thinking about it. I'm not sure yet, but I've been pondering talking about my Army experience. When I was in high school, I joined the Army at 22. Let me say that first. But when I was in high school, the first branch I wanted to join was the Marine Corps. So if you remember in part 2 where I talked about the PT test, when I got to the Marine Corps side, I had mentioned that I had some things I wanted to talk about with the Marine Corps. It's the first branch I ever looked at. My dad, he was a Marine Corps vet, or he is one, I should say. He served in the Marine Corps for 8 years, right? When I was in high school, I'll never forget there was a Marine, he was a gunnery sergeant. His name was Gunnery Sergeant Ware. I talked to him for a little bit. It was something I really was pondering. This was my junior year of high school, when I was, that time in your life where, you want to figure out what it is that you want to do. And of course, not everybody figures it out in their junior year or even their senior year or even after they graduate. But at some point or another, it is expected for you to figure out what you wanted to do. And for me, Marine Corps was the first thing. So a big part of that is because my dad was a Marine. I wanted to, follow in his footsteps, so to speak. I hadn't really ironed out at that point what I wanted to do yet. Force Recon Scout Sniper, that was one of the things I had wanted to do. My dad, he ultimately discouraged me from going Marines, not because of like the physical aspect or anything like that, but what he worried about, I guess for me, was more so the mental and more so like the job availability perhaps, because Marine Corps, their jobs are heavily reliant on combat, so they very rarely do they have, well, I'm not going to say they don't, they have some non-combat roles, but that was my dad's thing. He wanted me to make sure that whatever I did in the military, whenever I decided to get out, whether that be after 1 term or 2 terms, or I decided to take it to retirement, that I did something that would translate to the civilian world. So that was his thing with me. Ultimately, he had discouraged me, but it was one of the first branches. It was actually the first branch I considered joining, right? And the second one was Air Force before I ended up going Army. Air Force, I'm going to get to later in this video. There's something I do want to talk about there. It's funny how things turn out, I should say. Everybody knows life doesn't always work out the way you want it to. You can have a plan A, B, C, and shoot, all 3 plans sometimes can end up, not working out the way you want them to. So that happens. I want to go ahead and give my thoughts on the nutrition side of things. So, there was, so with nutrition, with everything that you do in the military, what you do, it requires a lot of energy, right? And the energy, of course, is going to come from proper nutrition. If you don't get proper nutrition, obviously, even with the energy, like even with as much as you do in the military, from PT to, working out in the heat and things like that, depending on your job. Like I said, y'all know I was a wheel vehicle mechanic. I went over that a little bit in part 1. So, wheel vehicle mechanics carry heavy things, throughout the day. Most of the time you'll be in a motor pool, you'll be inside of a bay. But sometimes, if a vehicle doesn't start, for you to be able to get it in the bay, or you don't have the towing capabilities at the moment, then you may have to work on it in the heat, depending on what's going on with it. So the military's taskings requires a lot out of you. So with that, proper nutrition is important. Now, I want to go over some examples of what happens when, or I'll just give at least one, right? Or maybe I'll give you 2, and I'll even use myself as an example. I remember there was a fellow soldier who, he did pretty good on his PT test. He was in great shape. He was actually kind of skinny. He was lanky, really. I'm gonna just keep it real with you. He was lanky, probably about 6'7" or so. He did good on his PT test, but I guess when we deployed, he started noticing that he wasn't performing that great. I don't want to say the sole reason for this was because of what he was eating in the DFAC, but at the same time, it is a contributor. So he would eat like a lot of burgers, fries, like a lot of heavily processed stuff, fast food. In the Middle East, they still do have McDonald's. They still do have like Burger King. There was a Burger King on post where I was on the camp that we were stationed at when we were there. So, they still do have fast food options. They have a Charlie's Subs grill. I think, well, maybe not at that one. I think this was at a different camp that we spent, time going back and forth at, but either way, there's still fast food options out there. So if you're not careful about what you eat, you may notice that your performance will decline, right? And that's kind of what happened to him. And it's also what happened to me too. When we first got there, I wasn't necessarily mindful of what I ate in the DFAC either. And I started noticing when I would go on runs, I would get heavily winded, and of course the change of the acclimation to a new environment, things like that do come into play, elevation and all of that. I noticed it when I first got stationed at Fort Hood in Texas. I was so used to being on the East Coast that when I finally go, to the, to central, west area, I noticed it was different. It took a while for me to get acclimated to. But once you get acclimated, normally you shouldn't have any issues, provided that you keep up with nutrition and, you keep training and everything like that, right? I wasn't necessarily eating the best. Every Thursday night was wing night. Every Friday night was surf and turf. Every Saturday night was Mongolian night at the DFACs where we were stationed at in the Middle East. So, of course I indulged, and eventually I had to kind of take a step back and be like, all right, I need to change up my eating habits a little bit. And I even started doing my own, PT outside of the usual PT we would do. So I started doing things like I believe it was every Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken. Every Wednesday, the command that we fell under when we deployed, we had an option, right? The option was either to do a 5K run, or, we would do PT with our own unit, whether it was platoon PT or as a company or what have you. And in an effort to get in better shape and to, improve my performance, every Wednesday I started doing the 5K with the rest of the, the command that would choose to do 5Ks. I did 5Ks every Wednesday, or at least I started doing that after some time being deployed. I would hit the gym, and then weight lift just to make sure I kept muscle content about me. Because of course, when you do nothing but cardio, you may lose out on muscle. In a sense, depending on, there's nuance there, but I don't have enough time to go into it in this video. But I would go into the gym to make sure I keep my muscle content about me, and then I would make sure that I ate right when I went to the DFAC. For breakfast, that's when I started eating nothing but egg white omelets and fruit, and then I made sure I made good choices for lunch and dinner, right? Chose from like lean chicken, lean meats, things like that, chicken breasts and all of that. They don't do pork over in the Middle East, so whatever options that they have for you there, you just kind of gotta go with it. You know what I'm saying? I mean, they still do turkey sausage, turkey bacon and things like that. They just don't do pork. When you're not careful about what you eat, and you're of course training and you're in a situation where your body heavily depends on energy, the right type of energy still matters. I went through this in part 3 where I talked about, the G for G program, or, go for green. So you have the green, yellow, and red, right? Well, green means they can engage your will, right? So items that are green, that'll be your whole foods, lean meats, fruits, vegetables, things like that. That's what you want to choose from. That's not saying that you can't, enjoy a nice happy meal, what I'm saying, every, no pun intended, I'm talking about McDonald's and whatnot, but you can't, it's not to say you can't enjoy a nice cheat meal or what have you every now and again, but you just want to be mindful about, how much you indulge. That's one thing I guess I could say I disagree with. In the military, the one thing I wish would change, and because to this day, I've been out since 2016, and to this day, talking to people that are still active duty or just recently separated or what have you, some things still haven't quite changed. And on the nutrition side, I wish that, there was more. I mean, sure, you can go into a DFAC and you can see the charts for Go for Green, things like that. That's a nice visual aid. I wish it was taught to folks that, how important and how crucial nutrition is to the military's daily life, right? To your daily functions when you're in the military. And it's not taught like that. I even remember when I was in basic training, right? When I was in boot camp, I had a drill sergeant, she was female, and probably the only female that we had in our platoon. She told us that if we joined the Army to get in better shape, then we came to the wrong place. And to be honest with you, I never really understood what that meant. And to this day, I still kind of don't. I've been trying to figure out what that meant, ever since she said it. And I still don't really know what that means. When you join the Army or just the military in general, the PT and things like that you do, it will get you in shape. But at the same time, what's not taught is what you should be eating in order to help your body get you in shape. So you see what I'm saying? Like you do have to eat, proper. So, you know what I'm saying? Nutrition is important. It's not enough for you to just do PT and then you go eat like crap. So I didn't quite get that one. Maybe you're all lucky to get you might get lucky to get a leader or superior, what have you, that teaches you about that kind of stuff. I don't know about battalion or brigade level. Maybe that's too far ahead. You know what I'm saying? It's always good to start small first. So maybe company level or even platoon level. Hell, it can even be the squad level. Teach your people about proper nutrition. Teach them why it's important that they eat whole foods, whole grains, fruits, veggies, and things like that, right? You got to teach them why that's important, because they'll perform at their best when they do. I want to talk about the tape test. Now, this is going to be a disagreement of sorts. Okay, so when I was in the Army, right? So me, just to give you some stats about me, I've always measured out at about 5'7" for height. Sometimes I can be 5'8" on a good day. It just depends. I've measured 5'8" on the PT test before too when doing height and weight, but mostly it was around about 5'7" and a half or so. If you don't know, in the military, when you do height and weight, based on what your height is, that determines how much you're allowed to weigh. You have a minimum and a maximum weight for your height, right? Now, because me, I've always been a more muscular guy, I typically always weighed more than I was supposed to for my height. I've always come out, weighing about my lowest was about 175. And then there were times where I would get up to 180, 181 or so, something like that. I always maintained around that area between 175 and like 181. Either way, that's more than the maximum weight. And I measured around that each time I took a PT test. After you take a PT test, usually you go to your company or wherever and you do height and weight. So they do your height, they do your weight. And if they find that you weigh more than your height, you essentially fail the weight test, but tape comes into play. So that's when they take a tape measure and they get your body fat content, your body fat percentage. They take a tape measure, they measure your waist, measure your neck, they get the measurements, and then, if you're within a good threshold for body fat percentage, then you failing the weight doesn't matter. And that's how it always was with me. Being 175 to 180 or so around that time, I always maintained between 14 and 16% body fat. So I was always good. But even though I was always good, it was a disagreement that I always shared with the Army, in the way they did height and weight. Before I joined the Army, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I looked at Air Force first. Marines, then Air Force, then Army. Air Force, I made it all the way up to MEPS, which is the, medical, screening, the processing center, right? You go for a medical screening and all of that. Do height and weight there too, you do like the duck walk and all that stuff. People who join the military, y'all know exactly what I'm talking about. But basically you do a medical screening. The recruiter I had, that was a rough one. So when I first went to the recruiter, I weighed about 185. And again, I was muscular, right? I was never a fat 180 anything or a fat 170 anything. Right now, I'm 204 pounds and you can see me, I'm not fat. You know what I'm saying? I'm still, 200. I've always been a muscular whatever weight that I'm at, except for high school, right? I was a chunky kid in high school, but I did everything to make sure I didn't go back to that point. So when I fluctuate in weight, it's never really because I'm plumped up, you know what I'm saying, so to speak. Either way though, I had first went to the recruiter at 185 and he saw me. The recruiter, he looked at me and said, man, you got a lot of muscle on you, but you being 185, you look like you weigh more than you're supposed to for your height. So I'm gonna need you to drop about 10 pounds before I could even talk to you. He said that. So I dropped 10 pounds. I got down to 175, went back to see him. Everything seemed fine at first until I go to processing, right? I do the medical screening and all that. I come back weighing 175, and even the doctor there that did the height and weight on me, he said, okay, so you do weigh a little more than you're supposed to for your height, but I can clearly see you have a lot of muscle content and your body fat percentage is low. You're in the teens, right? You're in the low to mid-teens. I think I was like 13% at that time, body fat. So he was like, you're good. You'll likely just get a waiver and then, that's it. You're a very muscular person. You seem to work out a lot. And that's going to help you going in the military because you're going to do a lot of PT. So just keep that up. That's what the doctor told me at the processing center. And so I get back to the recruiting office after I processed the first time. Because what happens is you process twice. You go to MEPS the first time just so they can see, you know, how you are, whatever, your medical screening, history, all that stuff. And then you go back to MEPS, you know, to do it one more time. But this time, that's when you ship out, whether by plane or by bus, depending on where your basic training, you know, boot camp site is at. You go twice. But that first time I came back, recruiter was like, so what's up with you being 175? And I was like, what's wrong with that? And, you know, I was just kind of like, I was confused. I was like, what's the matter with that? And he was like, well, you weigh a lot. I need you to get down to 165. I was like, wait a minute, so I came in 185. You told me to drop 10 pounds before you could even talk to me. Now you want me to drop 10 more pounds. I was like, what's the issue here? I should also note, I just find it funny that, you know, the recruiter I talked to at the time, he had a big pot belly, right? Like he had just this big ass pot belly. So that's why it kind of pissed me off when he told me I needed to drop 10 more pounds. It was really bothersome. You know what I'm saying? So that tape test, man, I got to tell you, it was kind of, it always bothered me just because I even had a white NCO tell me this in the military, right? Well, he was a staff sergeant and he told me straight up, you know something? You may already know this, but I want to tell you the height and weight standards, they weren't meant for people like you. And I kind of knew what he meant. I was just waiting for him to continue being as direct as he was, you know what I'm saying? And he eventually said it. He was like, for minorities like yourself, black people and brown people, you know, the height and weight standards, they were not meant for you. You know, it's based off, you know, the white male soldier. You know, it confirmed like my anger for the tape test. I hated getting taped. You know, it should just be like, why isn't it good enough that I passed the PT test and with flying colors? So what, I weigh a little bit more than I'm supposed to, but you can clearly see that I'm muscle, and I just passed the PT test before this. I never understood why that was a problem. You know what I'm saying? I hated that tape test. So in part 2, where I talked about the PT tests, for the Air Force's PT test, right? You know, it was a 100-point scale, 50, 15, 15, and 25, right? That's cardio, core, you know, muscle, and then body composition. So in the Air Force, you score points with body composition. That adds to your overall weighted score, right? Now, what I disagreed with, if you remember from part 2, if you watched it, I did every PT test I did in that video in part 2, I did a 21-year-old male and 21-year-old female soldiers requirements to pass the PT test. And for the Air Force, you know, the women, I just chose numbers, and the weight to height ratio that the Air Force uses, I don't agree with that at all either, especially not for women. Most of us know, see, women, they have the ability to carry kids, right? Women, they have what they call childbearing hips, right? When it comes to women and men, we carry our fat in different places. Men tend to carry more fat in their, you know, abdominal area, whereas women tend to carry, you know, more fat in their lower area. Obviously, that's not everybody. You know, there's nuance there, of course, too. But generally speaking, women carry more weight in their hips, you know, lower leg. I don't know why the standards is the way they are for them. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's kind of odd. If you pass a PT test, right? What good is height and weight? I mean, unless a soldier or a sailor or whatever, unless a military service member is extremely fat or like is you know, overweight or obese, like to the point where they're tired out or what have you, what's the point? Like, if you see someone who looks like me, right? Or even if you see a woman who, you know, carries a little more weight in the hips, but she's not fat per se. She, you know, maybe is a decent build. Now, if a soldier's obese or overweight, like to the point where they're borderline obese, I can understand that, right? Because you do got to be fit to fight, right? So when you become overweight and you let yourself go, I mean, you are risking essentially your career, right? And not only that, I mean, think about if you deploy and, you know, you're so overweight and you're unable to do the things that you're expected to do, you know, you're out in combat, we got to worry about you being able to do something that, you know, you're supposed to, but you might not be able to, or you might not have the stamina or the endurance to keep up. You see what I'm saying? Or maybe we got to pick you up and horse carry you out of harm's way. You know what I'm saying? Because you're hurt. Or maybe we got to drag you. You know what I'm saying? If we can't carry you physically, then maybe we got to drag you out of harm's way. But because of your weight, we may be unable to, or it may make it more difficult for us, putting us in even more danger. And I never agreed with the tape test at all. I just say it, I think there is bias when it comes to the tape test. It just kind of feeds into us having to work twice as hard, you know what I'm saying? And I've never agreed with that. I know people who can score 300s on their PT test. I remember it was a staff sergeant. He was a Hispanic guy in my company. Always passed flying colors. He got a 300. Back when the PT test was a 3-event test, push-ups, sit-ups, and a 2-mile run, he did 100 points in each event. That means he exceeded the maximum. And usually there's awards for things like that. When you get 300s on PT tests consistently, you get awards for stuff like that. So, but he was also he was a stocky guy too. He was about the same height as me, and he was like 175 or so. He was about the same weight as me too, to be honest with you. He could squat so much weight, bench press over 300 and some odd pounds. I mean, he was a part of that 1,000 pound club, right? When it came to weightlifting. So the Marines, right, and even other branches. So what I've noticed is, I know in the Army at least, the PT test, changing from the 3-event test to the now 5-event test, that was a thing, before the current administration was even thought about. You know what I'm saying, to be honest with you. So the switch up from, what I want to talk about specifically in the PT test is the core, right? So what seems to be the switch up from sit-ups to planks, that I do agree with, right? Sit-ups, planks, I believe, are better at, measuring your core strength, right? Because you're expected to hold a position for a certain amount of time, right? 1 minute and 30 seconds, or depending on whatever your age and, whatever it is, your age and your gender. Usually everybody has a specific time frame they have to beat when they initiate the plank part of the PT test. But the planks are better, right, at measuring core strength. Sit-ups was always done historically before your run. And for a lot of people, what I noticed, this even happened with me, but what I noticed with a lot of people when I was in the military is doing as many sit-ups as humanly possible, it winds you. You know what I'm saying? Like, you get heavily winded. Planks, you don't have to worry about constantly hitting your back on the ground, you know what I'm saying, and then having to come back up. You just sit there and hold a certain position for a certain amount of time, right? And it is ultimately, I'm gonna put up a study here, but as you can see, this study shows that doing planks anyway is better at measuring core strength than sit-ups. So it's good that, just about all branches use planks for their PT tests. Some branches, though, depending on whichever one it is, still have sit-ups as an option, like as an alternative. But again, that's at the commander's discretion, right? Or whoever the commanding officer is. Going back to nutrition, right? And this is a very important one. I had read something and this was on Fort Hood too. This was back in, maybe it was just a few years back. Maybe it was past 2020. There were, so where I was stationed at, right? Like where I was in Fort Hood, the barracks I stayed in, we had a DFAC that was like right there. It was called the Freeman DFAC. I remember that one. It was called Freeman DFAC. The problem with that DFAC is it only really opened for breakfast and lunch throughout the week, right? It never opened for dinner, and it barely opened on the weekends. For dinner, we had to go figure something else out. And usually for dinner, if we got off at 1700 like we were supposed to, because you got to keep in mind, DFACs, they only operate a certain amount of hours. So for dinner specifically, it was kind of a task trying to figure out where to go for dinner. A lot of us, of course, in the barracks, we would just go out and grab something to eat, or maybe we would go out and, get some stuff, because we had a little mini stove, like, it was a countertop with like 2 burners in the barracks room. We could cook something if we wanted to, or maybe, like me, I had a George Foreman grill, so I could put something on that grill. A roommate could throw something on the stove if he wanted to, or what have you. We could do something like that, if you're trying to eat a little healthier. But it did make it difficult trying to figure out what to get for dinner when the DFAC that's right by you never opens for dinner throughout the week. So now you're having to go elsewhere to another DFAC, like one of First Cav's other DFACs on Fort Hood. And if you don't have a car, it's kind of difficult for you to get, some transportation there unless you catch a ride with a buddy, perhaps, if they're not too busy, because that was always the case with me, like I had to get my own ride. And if I decide to, do a series about my Army experience, you'll hear more about that one, about why I had to get my own ride on Fort Hood. It's such a big base. you can't go really anywhere without a car. Fort Hood is not just the main, you got the main gate, then you got like West Fort Hood, which requires you leaving one of the main Fort Hood's gates to go into West Fort Hood's gate. Like it's a large installation, you know, it's no joke. So either way though, I say that to say there was an article here that I read, it caused issues with soldiers getting food, right? There were soldiers who didn't have rides or what have you, so, and of course there was no like real public transportation to take them places. You know, they recently, I believe on Fort Hood, started doing that. They started, you know, enabling public transportation of sorts, buses, to take soldiers to certain defects wherever they wanted to go, you know what I'm saying? In the article, I read something about a NCO that talked about whenever soldiers got released for lunch, you know, because some defects had closed right around this time, and the reason being is because obviously even defects, right, even cooks, they deploy just like anybody else, right? So when cooks deploy, essentially that kind of leaves defects undermanned, right? You don't have a lot of cooks to prepare the food at the defects for breakfast, lunch, and dinner when, you know, a lot of cooks have to deploy and go do training missions or go on field exercises for like weeks to a month or so at a time. So it leaves defects undermanned. And around this time, you know, it was, you know, an NCO shared about how he had soldiers under him that would go to the defect, you know, but they would end up being late for work, right? For lunch, you have lunch at 11:30 usually, right? On a normal lunch schedule is from 11:30 to about 1300. So you only get an hour and a half. Let's say you finally do find one, right? And that was the issue in this article. The NCO had said that soldiers under him were having to, like, you know, go from one part of the installation to another side of post, right? And that right there, you may be looking at about a 30-minute, you know, drive, or it's maybe 20 or so, whatever, right? But then by the time you get there, because it's lunchtime, you know, then that doesn't account for the long line that you have to wait in, because again, around this time, there wasn't a lot of defects open. A lot of defects were undermanned. So the ones that were left open, of course, everyone flocked to those defects, like all the single soldiers that live in the barracks would flock to those defects because those are the only ones that are open. And so, you know, you're dealing with this long line that you have to stand in to get something to eat. And as all this time is passing by, you still got to be back to work by 1300. Oftentimes, you're not making that, right? By the time you finally do get your food, maybe you had to wait like 40 or 45 or so minutes, right? And then you get your food, you gotta sit down and eat. And then once you're done eating, then you gotta drive all the way back from, you know, 20 or so minutes from one side of the post back to where you came from to go back to work. And an NCO had detailed that. Of course, he wanted to remain anonymous, but he detailed that in this article. So that was something even I dealt with. Not like, we didn't deal with like undermanned defects when I was in, but I do remember that the defect that stayed right next to us, it never really opened for dinner. You know, breakfast and lunch was never a problem. And this is especially true if, you know, we're working past 1700. See, if we're doing like a field exercise, for example, like I remember soon after I first got to Fort Hood, we did a training mission. It was at the motor pool. We didn't actually go anywhere, but we did a training mission, which is where we did like from 8 to 8. We worked 10 hours, right? We worked from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., right? 8 to 2000. Of course, we would still have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but the thing, you know, when you work until 2000, you know, when you have a defect that you live near that doesn't open for dinner, you're having to go elsewhere to find some food. As a single soldier, you get what's called a meal card, right? Every defect you go into, you show that meal card, it gets scanned or written down or whatever, and or put into the, you know, little system at the front. And then you go and you get your tray and you get your food. Tell the cooks what you want, and they put it on the plate for you. You sit down and eat. The last thing I want to talk about here is there's an initiative, and for right now, to my knowledge, I'm gonna go ahead and put this video up here.
The Fort Campbell Meal Prep Program is a new innovative solution to a problem that soldiers identified. So we've been hearing that soldiers don't utilize the dining facility as much because sometimes the lines are too long or it takes too much time for them to get through the line and get their food and eat it. So this meal prep program was designed to make meals quickly on the go Soldiers can just go in that day, pick them up, or they can even order them in advance for the next couple of days, particularly on the weekend, and they still have a healthy, nutritious meal. Meal card holders and non-meal card holders alike can utilize the program. The meal prep program is going to be produced out of Sun Cafe, but it's going to be delivered to all of the DFACs on post, so soldiers can pick them up at their respective DFACs.
Hopefully, all the other installations in the Army, hopefully they take the same initiative. I just don't necessarily know why this Fort Hood didn't figure something like that out. Because when you have on-demand, soldiers got to eat. See, married soldiers, they get what's called, basic allowance for housing and for subsistence, right? BAS. So the housing, of course, is supposed to pay for like their mortgage or their rent or wherever they're living. It's supposed to, it may not pay for it entirely. It depends on where you live, cost of living, all of that factors in, right? But the Army pays you a certain amount to help pay towards that. It may cover it all. It may cover 3/4 of it. It may even only cover half of it. Just depends on where you are. But the basic allowance for subsistence, the BAS, that's for food. They pay that to married soldiers so that they can go and get groceries. They can go and get stuff for their house or for their apartment or whatever. They get money for that. Meanwhile, single soldiers that live in the barracks, they get a meal card, and a portion of that meal card, a portion of what they eat, is taken out of their checks. Some of y'all know that too. I mean, I was a single soldier when I was in, so I would look at my leave and earning statement to see that it was like $300 or so taken out just about each paycheck or so, and it was for food. If money's gonna come out of a soldier's check, a single soldier's check for DFAC, for food, for them to have a meal card to eat at the DFAC, the very least that an installation could do is make sure that soldiers always have options to go and eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner at least. So I'll actually, before I end the video, talk about the Army's PT test. It's 5 events now, but it was 6 at its inception. The one that got removed was the standing power throw. And I do agree with that one, because the standing power throw, so you take a medicine ball and you throw it so far and high behind you, right? I'm glad they took that away, because the standing power throw, it's an explosive movement, but there are better explosive movements for you to, conduct without hurting yourself. That's what they found with the standing power throw. The Army, they went and evaluated it, and they were like, yeah, the standing power throw increases risk for injury to soldiers. So, because it's such an explosive movement, and with a movement like throwing a decent weighted medicine ball behind you, one of the first things that you can injure is your shoulders. And most of you know, when you injure your shoulder, it takes quite a while for it to heal. Your shoulder is if you can avoid, injuring your shoulder, definitely do, right? Definitely please avoid it at all costs. Whatever you can to help it. A shoulder injury is no small feat. In the PT test for the Army, the SDC, the sprint drag carry, I mean, you're doing sprints. You're already doing an explosive movement in the PT test in the first place, right? You're doing sprints to start off with, and then you end the sprint drag carry event with a sprint. And then that's before you get to the 2-mile run that you still have to do. You know what I'm saying? So, there's already explosive movements here that, that you can do that serve as a better alternative for the, standing power throw. That's pretty much going to be it. For fitness, I don't really see a disagreement with anything else. The preparation drill in the Army, I went over that in part 1. That I am glad for that, because preparation drill is a form of, it's a form of dynamic stretching, right? Normally, dynamic stretching is the type of stretches you do before you get into your main workout. And static stretching is what you do when you're done your workout. It's what you do to stretch your muscles out after you've already, worked out, so that you can lessen, how sore they get. You can help, increase blood flow to your muscles and lessen how sore they get. In the Army, those are called recovery drills, right? The recovery drills is the static stretching that you do after the workout's already completed. Physical fitness in the Army, I've never really had an issue with. Some of the things we did in the Army, as far as like sprints, I actually enjoyed. I remember in basic training, we started off doing like 30-60s, which is where you sprint for 30 seconds and walk for 60, and then do it all over again. And you do that a certain amount of times. Towards the end, they increase it to 61-20s. And wherever else you go, that's all you'll really do. Ability group runs is something else that you do as part of a run. If I had to like, pick something that kind of bothered me, I'd say it's the I say it's the company runs as well as the battalion and brigade runs. I can't stand those, and the reason why is because the battalion and brigade runs, you're essentially following, it's the battalion, is a certain amount of companies, right? And a brigade is a certain amount of battalions all combined together, right? So you're sitting in this huge formation, right? It's all the battalions put together if it's a brigade run, and if it's a battalion run, it's all the companies that are sitting together, and the commander of the battalion or the brigade, they're the one leading the run. So you're essentially having to run at a pace that's just like so repetitive and just like, I don't know, man. For me, it's always been, I can always run better when I'm running, when I'm doing 6120s, or I'm in a situation where I'm running and not having to keep up with anyone else while trying to maintain a formation, with the person in front of me, behind me, and to the left or right of me. I can't stand running in a formation, but it's one of the things that you do when you're in the military, so you just got to deal with it. But for me, just that slow pace, you know what I'm saying? And you might even get, so that's why the ability group runs I agree with. You have A group, B group, and C group, usually. They may have a D or whatever group, but most units, I think, try to avoid that. The A group are the fastest runners, as you can imagine, right? That's the alpha group. Those are the fastest runners, the ones who can score like 13 or so minutes on their 2 miles, or maybe even 14 minutes or so on their 2 mile runs for a PT test. Those are pretty much the ones who can run at a decent pace, at a faster pace for a longer amount of time. B group are the ones, of course, obviously, that are a little slower, but not so slow that, they can't, they're like maybe the 15-minute 2 milers, maybe low 16-minute 2 milers, and then you got the C group runners, who are the ones that definitely kind of struggle a little bit with the runs. So I do agree with that. I agree with the ability group runs, because then you take and you group people who, aren't that great at running, and you separate them from the people who can run, at a faster speed, right? At a faster pace. Muscle failure days, again, I never really had any issues with those. Muscle failure is, of course, you do CD1, CD2, or you may have a leader who, wants to kind of do something different, right? Maybe there's a big circle formation with the leader in the middle, and the leader is pointing out each soldier, right? Each soldier gets a turn, for the next hour or so, whenever, for how long PT is going on for. Each soldier gets a chance to call out an exercise for the entire group to do. Those are fun too. Something else we did was 4 corners, right? So you have a formation, and there's 4 people leading the PT test, essentially, right? Front, both sides, and then the back. And each person, right, they alternate, calling out an exercise for the whole group to do. Each person that's on the outside of the formation. That's why it's called 4 corners. Those are some of the things that I enjoy, but that's just me. I enjoy doing something that was outside of the normal. I mean, when you're in the military, you do the same things over and over again, and I get it. You train how you fight, that's what you're supposed to do, but it's okay to have fun once in a while too, and I'm glad I had some leaders that, allowed us to do that. Sometimes we would do off-post PT, and that was fun. You get away from post, you get away from doing the normal stuff. Always good when you can do a little something that's, a break from the normal. That is part 4. That concludes this military training series. I'll let y'all know if I do a series on the Army experience, my Army experience. That, if I decide to do that, you're definitely gonna want to tune in. It'll be, it might be a little more raw than how you usually see me. You may see just a little bit of a different side of me. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. That's kind of why I want to think about it, because I don't know if I want that side of me to come out just yet. So we'll see. I got family that watches this video, so that's part of why I always try to be mindful. But I am also a grown man, so we'll see what happens. We'll see. But for right now, y'all go ahead. Y'all have yourselves a great day or night, whatever time it is for you, and I will see y'all on my next video. Thank y'all for tuning in and hanging with me.